Let's say we're indifferent between two bundles, Q1, Q2, and Q1 prime, Q2 prime. And let's fix P2. Let's fix the price of good 2. And suppose that you are minimizing costs so that you stay on the same indifference curve, this indifference curve that both of these bundles are on. Remember, you're indifferent between these two bundles, so they're on the same indifference curve. And let's say you're minimizing costs to stay on that indifference curve. P2 is fixed, and we're just going to vary P1. Let's say at P1, you pick this bundle. So P1, at P1, Q1, Q2 is cost minimizing. Which means then that P1, Q1 plus P2, Q2 is no bigger than P1, Q1 prime plus P2, Q2 prime. Because this is the cost minimizing bundle. If this thing was smaller, then this wouldn't be the cost minimizing bundle. Instead, Q1 prime, Q2 prime would be the cost minimizing bundle. Now let's suppose when the price of good 1 changes from P1 to P1 prime, you pick Q1 prime, Q2 prime instead of Q1, Q2. By the same reasoning, since you're picking this, since this is a cost minimizing bundle, P1 prime, Q1 prime, P2, Q2 prime, remember we're not changing P2, has to be no bigger than P1 prime, Q1 plus P2, Q2. If you were to subtract this inequality from this one, what you'd get is the following. P1 minus P1 prime times Q1 minus Q1 prime is less than or equal to 0. So let's write that out. Since we're going to subtract 2 from 1, let's first flip the sign of inequality 2. Since we're going to flip the sign, we're going to multiply both sides by minus 1. The direction of the inequality is going to change. So this part is going to move to the left, this part is going to move to the right. So I'll stick a minus sign in front of every term. So I get minus P1 prime Q1 minus P2 Q2 is less than or equal to minus P1 prime Q1 prime minus P2 Q2 prime. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add 1 with this inequality. So let's do that down here. So we've got P1 Q1 minus P1 prime Q1. So got that and that. Plus P2 Q2 minus P2 Q2. These are going to cancel. We've got our inequality. Write down the next term, P1 Q1 prime minus P1 prime Q1 prime plus P2 Q2 prime minus P2 Q2 prime. Again, these two terms cancel. Let's erase the cancel term so we can clean this up a little bit. Get rid of that and get rid of this bit over here. Now what we notice here is that we can factor out some of these things. So this thing can be written as, we can factor out the Q1 here. So we can write this instead as Q1 times P1 minus P1 prime. Again, on this side, this thing, you can factor out the Q1 prime. So you can write Q1 prime times P1 minus P1 prime. So what we actually have is the following. We can get rid of this stuff. So what we have is that Q1 P1 minus P1 prime is less than or equal to Q1 prime P1 minus P1 prime. Well, we can subtract Q1 prime minus times P1 minus P1 prime from both sides, and that leaves us with, so Q1 times P1 minus P1 prime minus Q1 prime times P1 minus P1 prime is less than or equal to 0. So the last step before we can get to the final inequality is to factor out the P1 minus P1 prime. So if you factor those out, you get P1 minus P1 prime times Q1 minus Q1 prime, which is this thing. What this tells us is that if you were to decrease the price, so P1 is bigger than P1 prime, that means this part is positive, then this has to be negative. So if the price goes down, then the quantity demanded has to go up. Conversely, if this is a negative, if the first part is a negative number, so the price went up, then the product has to be negative, so the second part has to be positive. So it says that if the price of good one goes up, then the compensated demand has to go down. Conversely, if the price goes down, the compensated demand has to go up. So what we've shown here is that compensated demand has to satisfy the law of demand.